So in this lesson, we're going to add a control to scale the eyeball as well as the geometry around the eyeball. We're going to start by creating a cluster. Let's open the attribute editor. I'm going to use the drag cluster that we've already created to quickly select the vertices in that cluster and then create a new cluster with the same selection. I'm going to open the attribute editor. Okay, click on the iDrag cluster, hit select, then select the form, edit membership. You can see we have the vertices within that iDrag cluster already selected. With that done, and select the form, create cluster, and I open the option box to make sure that the mode is set to relative. Create. And once again, this cluster is not centered within the spherical eye. So what we're going to do is, once again, create a locator and use that as the handle for this new cluster. So create locator. Just quickly rename this. I'm going to point constrain this to the eye offset locator so that this new locator will be centered within the eye. So constrain point, and we can delete that point constraint node once we've repositioned it. Now I'm going to use this new locator, the eye scale CSR, as the handle for this cluster here. So select the cluster and open the attribute editor. Click on the handle shape tab, the cluster handle shape tab, and in the weighted node, rename it to the object that we want to act as the handle, in this case the left eye scale underscore CSR. So now we can look and activate the scale tool. Okay, so you can see that we're scaling the vertices around the eye. Now what we need to do is I'm going to connect, well, first let's connect the scale attributes of this cluster locator to the scale attributes of the eye. So with the locator selected, click on Window, General Editors, Connection Editor, and load the eye scale cluster, that locator, into the outputs. Scroll down to the outputs column, select the eye geometry, load that into the inputs, and connect the scale, the eye cluster locator, to the scale of the eye geometry. Select this locator. So there we can see both the eye as well as the geometry around it are scaling. Now it's a matter of painting the fall off of this cluster, and we could easily extend this cluster to include more vertices. We'll do that. First I'm going to select the geometry here and change the deformation order. So with the mesh selected, click on the inputs icon and click on the all inputs at the bottom and drag this cluster beneath the skin cluster. Just quickly rename this cluster. Okay. I'm going to parent this cluster, the eye scale cluster, to the head 3 joint. You can see our cluster handle is still visible. Although it has no effect, I'm going to hide it anyway. So with the eye scale cluster locator selected, Open the attribute editor. Then select the iScale cluster. Let's move this over here so we can see. iScale cluster. There we go, the CSR. And turn off the visibility. We can delete that cluster node. Let's test this. Make sure our deformation order is working out. Let's scale our eyeball up. Select our eye controller, and our drag is set to 0.1. So they're working nicely together. Okay, so set the scale back to 1. I'm going to hide some of these attributes. I'm going to hide the visibility, and then lock and hide the rotate channels. So now we're going to extend this cluster by adding some more vertices in. Okay, so I'm going to select this iScale cluster locator, open the attribute editor, scoot this over again, select the iScale cluster, and then hit select. So with this iScale cluster selected, I'm going to select Deform, Edit Membership. So now we can add vertices into this cluster. So holding down the Shift key, I'm just going to broadly add them in and then selectively remove them. Okay, so now let's start removing these extraneous vertices. A little more cleanup. To remove these, I'm holding down the Control key while in the Edit Membership tool. Okay. So now I'm going to select this iScale cluster, activate the scale manipulator. Now we can see we've greatly extended the iScale. So I'm going to go in and paint the fall off for this. Once again, I can select the geometry and right mouse click, select the paint menu and the cluster, and then select the appropriate cluster, or I could select Deform, Paint Cluster Weights tool, and the option box. Okay, so now with the brush still set as a solid brush and 100% opacity, and with the operation set to replace, I'm going to click and select the appropriate cluster. Add in this one stray vertex. Okay, go back to the Edit Membership tool, so we can see we left out this one vertex. So now let's go back to our paint tool. This time I'm going to use the right mouse button, cluster, select our eye scale cluster weights, double click on this tool. So once again, opacity at 100%, a solid brush, and our operation set to replace. I'm going to start just reducing the weights of the influence of this cluster toward the outer edge. A process very similar to what we did with the drag cluster. Okay, that's 0.25. Now let's go to 0.5. Okay, now 0.75. Once again, this is very rough weighting here, just blocking it out just to make sure that we have a basic weighting to start our deformations from. Okay, this is gonna require some adjustment. Let's see what we have here. Okay, so there's a control, so the animator could go in and scale the eye as well as the geometry around it. Once again, this is very rough weighting. We're just setting up the control here. It's just a matter of going into the cluster and adjusting the fall off. Okay, so there's our eye scale. So now that we've added the eyeing rig, the lid drag control, as well as a scaling control for the eye and as much geometry around the eye as you feel is appropriate for your character.